Although we have elected representatives to voice our opinions in the legislature, that doesn't mean you shouldn't speak up. Don't forget, democracy means rule by the people. So if you see something that needs to be changed, it's your responsibility to try and fix it. There's various ways we can have our voices heard. The two most common are through the media and lobby groups. Lobby groups are very similar to political parties. They're a group of people with similar opinions who work together to try and make our country a better place. But unlike political parties, they don't have a direct role in having someone elected to office. And most lobby groups have a relatively specific issue that they want to focus on. Lobby groups can include labor unions, religious organizations, agricultural workers, ethnic groups, major corporations, environmentalists, and those concerned with social issues. Often when we think of lobby groups, people will think of things like MAD or the NRA, but there are hundreds of lobby groups that look at a variety of issues. Lobby groups are also known as pressure groups because they're usually created to pressure the government to do something. These groups can get support for their ideas through the media, like the use of television commercials. Some lobby groups will also use stunts to get people's attention, use social media to get the word out, or finance opinion polls or other research to demonstrate how their ideas are supported and would work. Let me pause here for a second to talk about opinion polls. We've been using opinion polls throughout the history of our country. An opinion poll asks several people a question and then uses statistics to show how a whole lot of other people would have responded to that question. Kind of like Family Feud, if you've ever seen that show. Politicians want to get as many votes as possible, so they'll hire a company to do a survey of a group of people to let politicians know what policies they should be supporting. While the use of opinion polls seems to be increasing with our improvements in technology, the accuracy of those polls is going down because of our improvements in technology. Why? Well, many opinion polls depend on phoning people to get a sample of people to talk to. And now that people have call display, they don't answer their phone for telemarketers who might be working for a polling company. Other polls depend on people responding to an online question, and most people don't take the time to do this. So that means we're not getting a wide variety of opinions from different groups in society. There's also the issue of how these opinion polls can influence our politicians. While we want our politicians to know what we think they should be doing to govern the country, we can't have them making policies based on flawed opinion polls. And even if the polls are correct, sometimes politicians have to make tough decisions that aren't popular. Public opinion polls were against the government giving women the right to vote or to give minorities equal rights. But I think we all agree today that that was the right decision to make at the time. Let's get back to lobby groups. Another approach that they can take is to have people whose job it is to work directly with government officials to try and influence them. They're known as lobbyists. There is some controversy regarding lobbyists, as they are unelected individuals who can gain access to government officials by building relationships with either the politician or her staff. The wealthier lobby groups can afford to wine and dine the politicians. They can help the politicians get elected by making large campaign contributions. And isn't it more likely that a politician would listen to somebody they know and who's done them a favor instead of just somebody off the street? So democracy can be challenged by this very democratic idea. We have the right to speak to our politicians to influence them, but lobby groups often mean that those with more money get more power and influence. Lobby groups can also use the judicial branch to influence the government, as they'll launch Supreme Court cases to challenge the validity and constitutionality of laws. Remember, in a previous video, we talked about how the Supreme Court listens to cases where people are concerned that the government has passed unfair laws. But again, money comes into play here because it can be very expensive to launch a Supreme Court case. I mentioned earlier that lobby groups can use the media to get their message out. Well, you can use the media as well. The media is an essential part of democracy because it not only shares the information with us and keeps the government in check, which means doing what it's supposed to do, but we can use the media to influence the government. In a democracy, it's important for your citizens to be educated and informed because it is rule by the people. That's why we want you to pay attention to the news. When you know what's going on around you on a regular basis, you'll be better able to make a difference and make your community a better place. So the government can use the media by running advertisements about new government policies or getting interviewed on the news. There's also something in the House of Commons called the scrum. Just like in rugby, but when discussing the government scrum, it's a tightly packed group of reporters surrounding a member of parliament. You'll often see this as part of the nightly news updates. Political parties can also use the media, especially during an election campaign, to not only get attention to their party platforms, but also to attack their opponents, which is becoming more and more common. And like that advertising technique of name-calling, it turns me off, and I can't stand it when politicians waste time and money doing this. We can also use the media by writing letters to the editor, getting a news program to cover a rally or other activity we've organized, or trying to get an interview on a news program. Recently, there were terrible floods in the Calgary region, and the government's response to those impacted by the flood damage was frustrating for many homeowners. By inviting the media to come and cover their story, these people were able to influence the government to rethink their flood recovery responses. Now, like most everything, there is a downside to the use of the media. One of the biggest issues is bias. No matter how much we try to ignore it, human communication always takes place in a context. We can't say everything. And because the producer of a news show can't explain everything, she has to decide what's going to be on the show. This creates a bias. We need to be aware that we're not going to get all the facts. In the past, newspapers admitted to bias and used this to sell more papers by exaggerating the truth. We called this yellow journalism. Today, most news programs try to be more balanced, but a news story is not the same as news commentating. As long as we're aware of that bias, we can still be informed by the media. In fact, the more informed you are, the better you'll be able to detect bias. For example, there's many people on the right who assume that most of the news we watch on TV has a left-wing bias, and people who are left-wing assume that anything that's on Fox News has a right-wing bias. And yet, a university study showed that while there is bias on programs, it's not as bad as we think it is, and most news coverage is relatively balanced. Again, I'm saying news coverage, not the truly biased discussion panels that are on 24-hour news stations. So you can see, there's really good reasons for why lobby groups and media are key aspects of a democracy. These institutions allow for information to be shared, keep the government from becoming too powerful, and allow us to play a role in governing our nation.